Chapter 1. The Lonely Exile. Shariana shivered as the cold wind whipped across the barren landscape of Gathos. 5. This was a planet so desolate that even the star maps warned travelers away from it. Her violet skin, bruised and torn, bore the marks of days spent wandering across jagged rocks and through abandoned ruins. She pulled her torn cloak tighter around her, feeling the sting of the dry, icy air against her face. Every step was heavier than the last, and her once bright and vibrant eyes now carried a dull, distant look of despair. She had been left to die here, exiled by her people, the Zitherans. Shariana was not like the others on her home planet, a place of order, tradition, and conformity. She had always questioned things, poking at the boundaries her society imposed. Her curiosity was seen as a threat, but it was her compassion for the lesser caste Zitherans that had brought about her downfall. In her heart, she knew that trying to change the rigid structures of her society was dangerous, but she hadn't anticipated just how dangerous. The council had accused her of treason, of colluding with enemies of the Zitharan state. She remembered standing in the grand courtroom, her father, an influential diplomat, remaining silent as the charges were read. The betrayal had stung more than anything. He could have defended her, could have saved her from the fate that awaited. Instead, he had chosen his position, his reputation, over his own daughter. The sentence had been swift. Exile on Gathos. 5. A planet known for its harsh conditions and deadly predators. Shariana had thought she was prepared for the isolation, but nothing could have readied her for the crushing loneliness she felt now. Days had turned into weeks, and weeks into months, or so it seemed. Time had blurred in her mind as survival became her only focus. The planet offered little in the way of food or water, and the creatures that roamed its surface were unlike anything she had ever seen before. Twisted, monstrous beings that hunted anything they could find. She had narrowly escaped death several times, using her agility and quick thinking to evade the beasts. But the constant running, the lack of sustenance, and the brutal conditions were wearing her down. She didn't know how much longer she could hold out. As the sun began to set, casting an eerie red glow over the cracked and broken ground, Shariana spotted the outline of what appeared to be a large structure in the distance. A ruin, perhaps, from a civilization long forgotten. Gathos. 5 had once been a thriving world, or so the stories said, but now it was a graveyard. Still, the ruins offered shelter, and that was something she desperately needed. Her legs trembled with exhaustion as she made her way toward the ancient building. It had the look of a spaceport, though long abandoned. The architecture was unlike anything she had seen before, massive and imposing, with strange symbols etched into the stone. Vines of thick, blackened vegetation had overgrown the structure, but she could still make out remnants of what might have been landing pads and docking stations. Shariana entered the building cautiously, her senses on high alert. Inside, it was dark and cool, the walls cracked and crumbling. Dust floated in the air, disturbed by her footsteps. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the distant creak of metal shifting in the wind. She found a corner where she could rest, her back against the cold stone wall. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to close her eyes, but sleep did not come easily. Her mind raced with thoughts of home, of her betrayal, and of her uncertain future. Would she die here, alone and forgotten? Would anyone ever know what had happened to her? Suddenly, a sound broke the stillness. A faint clanging, like metal against metal. Shariana's eyes snapped open, her heart pounding in her chest. She stood quickly, her hand instinctively reaching for the small blade she had fashioned from scraps of metal she had found during her scavenging. The sound came again, closer this time. It was deliberate, rhythmic. Someone or something was nearby. Shariana moved silently through the ruin, following the noise. Her eyes adjusted to the dim light as she crept around a corner, her pulse quickening with each step. And then she saw it. A figure, bent over a small vessel that looked as old and battered as the ruins themselves. The figure was humanoid, though clad in worn, patched-up armor. They seemed to be working on the ship, tools in hand, oblivious to her presence. Shariana's heart raced. A ship meant away off this planet, a chance at escape. But could she trust whoever this was? Her mind raced with possibilities. If this person was a scavenger or a pirate, they might be dangerous. But if they were stranded here like she was, They could be her only hope. She had no choice but to find out. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, her voice steady but soft. "Who are you?" The figure froze, then slowly turned to face her. A man, with pale skin and a rugged, weathered look. His eyes widened in surprise as he took her in, her violet skin, her sleek, alien features, and the makeshift blade in her hand. He raised his hand slowly, showing he wasn't armed. "I could ask you the same thing," the man said, his voice low and calm. "But if you're from this planet, I'm the one who should be worried." Shariana lowered her blade slightly, studying him. He didn't seem like a threat, at least not immediately. His voice carried a rough accent, one she had never heard before. And then she saw the symbol on his armor. It was faint, almost worn away, but unmistakable. The crest of Earth. A human. Her eyes widened in shock. Humans were supposed to be extinct, wiped out in the great galactic wars centuries ago. Their homeworld had been destroyed, and the survivors scattered across the galaxy, their numbers dwindling over time. But here was one, standing right in front of her. You're human?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The man raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, what of it?" Shariana's mind spun. If this man was truly human, then the stories were true. The humans had been a resilient race, known for their ingenuity and survival instincts. But they were also known for their stubbornness and their capacity for violence. She had no idea which kind of human she was dealing with. "I'm Shariana," she said cautiously, keeping her distance. "I was exiled here, by my people." The man nodded, lowering his hands. "Name's Elias. Been stuck here for a while myself. Ship's broken, as you can see. Been trying to fix it, but this place isn't exactly brimming with spare parts." Shariana glanced at the ship, her eyes narrowing. It looked old, older than any ship she had seen before, and in terrible condition. But if Elias could fix it, there was a chance it could still fly. "You're trying to fix that?" she asked skeptically. Elias shrugged. "It's not much, but it's better than dying here. You got a better plan?" Shariana's mind raced. She could try to find another way off the planet, but that would take time she didn't have. And Elias seemed to know his way around technology, which could be useful. But trusting him was a risk. "Maybe I can help," she said slowly. "But I don't trust you." Elias smirked. "Fair enough. I don't trust you either." And so, an uneasy alliance was formed. Shariana agreed to help Elias with the repairs, though she kept her distance, always watching him for any signs of betrayal. The days passed slowly as they worked together, scavenging the ruins for parts and tools. Shariana's knowledge of advanced Zithran technology came in handy, and together they made slow but steady progress. But the planet was not kind. Every night, the creatures grew bolder, their howls echoing through the ruins as they hunted. Shariana and Elias took turns keeping watch, their nerves fraying with each passing day. As the ship neared completion, Shariana began to wonder if she had made the right choice in trusting Elias. There was something about him, something he wasn't telling her. And as the nights grew darker and the creatures grew closer, she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. Chapter 2. A Fragile Alliance. The cold light of Gathos 5's twin moons illuminated the desolate landscape, casting eerie shadows across the ruins as Shariana and Elias worked tirelessly. They had formed a tentative truce, but trust was still in short supply. Every glance they exchanged was filled with suspicion, each motion calculated. Both of them knew that survival came first, and trusting a stranger on a planet that seemed designed to kill was dangerous. Shariana stood near the remains of what once appeared to be a control tower, her violet eyes scanning the dark horizon. The creatures of Gathos 5 were growing bolder, and tonight the noises of their distant howls seemed unnervingly close. She tightened her grip on her makeshift blade, the sharp edges catching the moonlight. Though she had agreed to help Elias repair the ancient ship, her instincts remained on high alert. Elias was still a mystery to her, a human, a race she had only heard about in ancient tales. "You look tense," Elias said from behind her, his voice breaking the silence. He was crouched beside the ship, working on what appeared to be the navigation panel, which had long since been gutted by time and weather. His voice was casual, but Shariana didn't miss the undercurrent of weariness. Life on Gathos 5 was draining for both of them. "We're not safe here," Shariana replied, her eyes not leaving the horizon. Those creatures are getting closer. It's only a matter of time before they attack. Elias glanced up, wiping his hands on his ragged trousers. His pale face, weathered by exposure to the planet's harsh conditions, bore the look of someone who had been through more than he cared to discuss. "You're right," he said with a sigh. "But I'm almost done. A few more adjustments, and this thing should be ready to fly. It'll be tight, but it'll hold." Shariana turned to face him, her arms crossed. She had grown accustomed to the strange rhythms of this human, his nonchalant attitude toward danger, his quick improvisation with technology, and most of all, his ability to keep his emotions in check. It was unnerving. Her people, the Zitherans, wore their emotions on their sleeves, but Elias was a closed book. She still didn't know whether to trust him, but she knew she had no other options. "Do you really think it'll get us off this planet?" she asked, her voice laced with doubt as she pointed toward the dilapidated ship. The vessel was a relic, its exterior battered and patched with various scavenged parts. From her perspective, it looked more like a grave than an escape. Elias smirked, standing up and dusting his hands off. "If it doesn't, then we'll be stuck here forever, won't we?" Shariana wasn't in the mood for jokes. "I can't stay here, Elias. This planet is killing me slowly. If we don't leave soon, those creatures will finish the job." Elias nodded, his expression turning serious. "I know. I've been stuck here longer than you, remember?" He paused for a moment, glancing around at the dark, looming shapes of the ruins surrounding them. "You never told me why you were exiled." Shariana stiffened, her posture tightening at the mention of her past. "I told you. My people framed me. I was accused of treason. They said I sold secrets to our enemies, but it wasn't true. I was just trying to help those who were suffering." Elias raised an eyebrow. "And they exiled you for that?" Shariana's voice turned bitter. "The Zitharan government doesn't tolerate dissent. Even if you're trying to do something good, if it goes against their rigid rules, they'll punish you for it. My father, he could have stopped it, but he chose his reputation over me." There was a long silence between them, broken only by the distant cries of the creatures in the night. Elias seemed to be processing her words, though his expression didn't change. Finally, he spoke, his tone softer than before. "I know what it's like to be abandoned." Shariana looked at him, surprised by his sudden vulnerability. "You? By who?" Elias gave a small, humorless laugh. "My crew. The pirates. I was part of a salvage team, nothing illegal, just scavengers trying to make a living. We were hit by a pirate ship during one of our runs. They took what they wanted and left me here, figuring I wouldn't survive." Shariana's eyes softened. In that moment, she saw beyond the stoic exterior he had built around himself. For the first time, she understood the depth of his desperation. They were both exiles, both abandoned by those they had once trusted. "How long have you been here?" she asked. Elias shook his head. "I stopped counting after the first few weeks. Time moves differently when you're trying to survive." Shariana nodded. She knew the feeling all too well. Suddenly, a sharp screech echoed through the ruins, sending a chill down Shariana's spine. Both she and Elias froze, their eyes darting toward the source of the noise. It was close, too close. "We need to get inside," Elias said, his voice low and urgent. He grabbed a makeshift weapon from the ground, a metal rod with jagged edges, and motioned for Shariana to follow him toward the interior of the ship. They had taken refuge in its hull before, though it provided little protection from the more dangerous predators that roamed the planet at night. They hurried into the ship, closing the rusted hatch behind them. The interior was cramped, barely large enough for two people. Wires dangled from the ceiling, and the floor was littered with discarded tools and parts. Elias had done his best to make it habitable, but it was far from comfortable. Shariana pressed her back against the cold metal wall, her heart racing. The sounds of movement outside grew louder, footsteps, slow and deliberate. She exchanged a glance with Elias, whose grip on his weapon tightened. The creatures of Gathos. 5 were unlike anything she had ever encountered. Their skin was covered in hard, chitinous plates, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They were fast, strong, and deadly, hunting in packs. And now, one of them was right outside. Elias motioned for her to stay quiet as he crouched by the small porthole, peering out into the darkness. Shariana held her breath, her body tense with anticipation. For several long moments, there was nothing but silence. And then, with a sudden burst of speed, the creature lunged at the ship, slamming its body against the side with a deafening crash. The impact shook the entire vessel, sending tools and debris flying. Shariana instinctively reached for her blade, her heart pounding in her chest. Elias cursed under his breath, pulling her back as another loud thud rattled the ship. The creature outside snarled, its claws scraping against the metal hull as it tried to tear its way inside. "They're getting bolder," Elias muttered. "We can't keep this up. We need to get this ship off the ground now." Shariana nodded, adrenaline coursing through her veins. The creatures were relentless, and it was only a matter of time before the ship's fragile defenses gave way. They had to act fast. Elias turned toward the control panel, frantically flipping switches and checking the system's status. Shariana could see the strain in his eyes, the urgency in his movements. The ship wasn't ready, but they didn't have a choice anymore. It was either risk launching now or stay and face the creatures. The ship groaned under the force of another impact, and Shariana could hear the distinct sound of metal tearing. Her pulse quickened. The creatures were breaking through. "Elias," she shouted. "We have to go." "I know," Elias shouted back, his fingers flying across the controls. "Hold on." The ship's engines sputtered to life, shaking violently as the power surged through the old systems. Shariana braced herself, her heart pounding as the ship slowly lifted off the ground. The creatures outside screeched in frustration, their claws scrabbling at the metal as the ship began to ascend. Shariana could see them through the porthole, twisted, grotesque figures bathed in the glow of the moonlight. They snarled and roared, but they were too late. With a deafening roar, the ship shot into the sky, leaving the creatures behind. Shariana let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her body sagging with relief. They had made it. They were off Gathos 5. But as the ship soared through the atmosphere, Shariana couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were far from over. The journey had only just begun. Chapter 3. Escape into the Unknown. As the ship soared higher into Gathos 5's atmosphere, Shariana could feel the intense pressure pushing her back into her seat. The old vessel groaned in protest, its engines sputtering and coughing. But somehow it held together, carrying them away from the hostile planet below. Sweat trickled down her brow as she gripped the armrests, her knuckles turning white. She glanced over at Elias, who was frantically working the controls, his brow furrowed in concentration. The cockpit was small and cramped, barely enough room for the two of them. Sparks flew from a nearby console, and the overhead lights flickered sporadically, casting the interior in an eerie, strobe-like glow. Every creak and rattle from the aging ship sent a shiver down Shariana's spine. She had flown in vessels before, advanced, sleek Zitharan cruisers that were a testament to her people's engineering prowess, but this rusted relic was something else entirely. "How long until we break atmosphere?" Shariana asked, her voice strained as the ship continued to shudder violently. "Not long," Elias grunted, his fingers moving rapidly over the control panel. "Just hold on. She's gonna hold, she has to." Outside the viewport, the skies darkened as they ascended, the pale red haze of Gathos 5's toxic atmosphere giving way to the deep black of space. For a moment, Shariana allowed herself to hope. They had escaped the planet, but her relief was short-lived as another series of loud, metallic groans echoed through the ship's hull. Suddenly, the ship lurched violently to one side, sending them both crashing against the bulkhead. Shariana gasped, clutching at the nearby console to steady herself as the vessel spun uncontrollably. "What's happening?" she shouted, panic rising in her chest. Elias cursed under his breath, pulling hard on the manual controls. "The stabilizers are shot. I told you this ship wasn't ready." He yanked on a lever, trying to regain control as alarms blared around them. Red warning lights flashed across the cockpit, and the ship's artificial gravity sputtered, sending them into a brief, sickening freefall. Shariana's stomach churned as the world spun around her, but Elias fought against the ship's failing systems with grim determination. His face was pale, his jaw clenched tightly, but his hands were steady on the controls. Slowly, the ship began to level out, though it continued to groan and shudder ominously. "There. We're out." Elias exclaimed. His voice a mix of relief and exhaustion as they finally broke free of Gathos 5's gravity. The planet shrank behind them, its red and barren surface fading into the backdrop of stars. Shariana exhaled deeply, her muscles relaxing as the immediate danger passed. They were in space now, cold, vast, and seemingly endless, but at least they had escaped the hellish surface of the planet. For the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of hope. But as she glanced at the flickering control panels, her optimism quickly faded. Elias slumped back in his seat, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Well," he said with a weary grin, "we made it off the ground. Now all we have to do is not die in the middle of space." Shariana didn't laugh. She could hear the strain in the engines, feel the unsteady hum of the ship's systems barely holding together. The ship might have gotten them off Gathos 5, but it wasn't built for long-term survival in the vacuum of space. "We need to find somewhere safe," she said, her voice steady but urgent. "Do we have any way of detecting nearby planets or stations?" Elias shook his head, grimacing. "Most of the ship's scanners are fried. We're flying blind right now." He leaned over the console, tapping a few keys. But the long-range comms seemed to be working. "If we can send out a distress signal, maybe we can get lucky." Shariana frowned, her heart sinking. A distress signal? In the far reaches of the galaxy, it was just as likely to attract pirates or slavers as it was to bring help. Still, they had little choice. Elias activated the communications panel, inputting a generic distress call. "This is Elias Carter, captain of the Redbird, requesting immediate assistance. We've escaped Gathos 5, but our ship is badly damaged. We need emergency repairs or transport. Repeat, this is Elias Carter requesting assistance." The message played on a loop as they drifted through the vast emptiness of space. Shariana could feel the weight of the unknown pressing in on her. Gathos 5 had been a nightmare, but space held its own dangers unseen, silent threats that could destroy them without warning. "What if no one comes?" she asked quietly, her eyes fixed on the distant stars. Elias didn't respond right away. He leaned back in his seat, his expression thoughtful, before finally answering. "Someone will come. Whether that's good or bad remains to be seen." The hours dragged on in silence, broken only by the faint hum of the ship's systems and the steady loop of the distress signal. Shariana stared out the viewport, her mind racing. She had thought Gathos 5 would be her tomb, but now the vastness of space threatened to be an even more desolate grave. Still, there was a flicker of hope, fragile though it was. The human beside her was resourceful, and if they could survive Gathos 5, maybe they could survive this too. Suddenly, a soft ping echoed through the cockpit, breaking the tension. Elias sat up straight, his eyes widening as he scanned the instruments. "We've got something," he said, his voice laced with both surprise and caution. Shariana leaned forward, her heart pounding. "What is it?" "Not sure," Elias muttered, his fingers dancing across the control panel. "But we're picking up a signal A response to our distress call. It's coming from a nearby ship." Shariana's breath caught in her throat. Help? Or danger? Elias narrowed his eyes at the display. The ship's ID tag is unfamiliar. Not any official fleet I recognize. Could be traders or pirates. Shariana's mind raced. "Do we have any way of knowing their intentions?" "Not unless they broadcast a message," Elias replied, his voice tense. "But it's a risk. If they're hostile, we might be sitting ducks. This ship can't handle any kind of confrontation." The seconds stretched out into an agonizing eternity. Then, a crackling voice came through the comms, distorted by interference but unmistakable. "Redbird, this is the Horizon's Grace. We've received your distress signal and are approaching your location. Prepare for docking procedures. We can offer assistance." Shariana and Elias exchanged a wary glance. The voice was calm and professional, but there was no way to know for sure if they could trust them. But what choice did they have? "What do we do?" Shariana asked, her heart pounding in her chest. Elias hesitated for a moment before finally speaking. "We let them dock. If they're hostile, we'll have to improvise. But we can't survive out here for long. This might be our only chance." Shariana nodded, though the knot of anxiety in her stomach tightened. The ship rattled again as the Horizon's Grace approached. She could hear the soft hiss of the docking mechanism engaging, the airlocks aligning. Her hands trembled slightly as she tightened her grip on her blade, preparing for the worst. The airlock door hissed open, and the figures that stepped through weren't what Shariana had expected. Tall, armored beings with sleek, reflective suits. They moved with precise, mechanical grace, and their helmets obscured their faces. Her heart raced. Were they human? Or something else? One of the figures stepped forward, raising a hand in what appeared to be a gesture of peace. The voice that came from the helmeted figure was calm and authoritative. "We're here to help," the stranger said, their tone steady. "But you'll need to follow our instructions if you want to survive." Shariana's eyes narrowed. Something about the way they said it made her uneasy. Elias glanced at her, his expression unreadable, but she could see the tension in his stance. They had escaped Gathos, 5, but their fight for survival was far from over. Chapter 4. The Unknown Rescuers. The tension in the air was palpable as the armored figures stood in the dimly lit interior of the Redbird. Shariana and Elias exchanged wary glances, unsure of what to make of their would-be rescuers. The being's sleek armor shimmered faintly under the overhead lights, and though their helmets obscured their faces, the air of authority they exuded was unmistakable. Elias, his hand still hovering close to his makeshift weapon, spoke first. "We appreciate the rescue, but you'll have to forgive us if we're a bit cautious. We don't know who you are." The leader of the group, the one who had spoken before, stepped forward, their voice calm but firm. "I understand your hesitation. My name is Commander Rail, and this is my crew from the Horizon's Grace. We received your distress signal and came to assist, but the situation is more complicated than it seems. You're in a dangerous part of space, and staying out here any longer is a death sentence." Shariana felt a cold chill run down her spine. The way Rail spoke, there was an underlying urgency in their words, as if something far more dangerous lurked just beyond the reaches of their current location. Her instincts told her to be on guard, but they were in no position to refuse help. Their ship was barely functional, and the creatures on Gathos, 5 had almost torn them apart. They couldn't afford to turn away potential allies. Still, trust didn't come easily. "Why are you out here?" Shariana asked, her eyes narrowing. "This region of space is supposed to be off-limits. The only reason we're here is because we had no other choice." Rail hesitated, then spoke carefully. "We patrol these fringe systems for salvage and other operations. I can't go into detail, but let's just say that the galaxy has forgotten about this part of space, and we operate where others won't." Elias, his expression skeptical, crossed his arms. "Other operations? What kind of operations are we talking about?" Before Rail could answer, one of the armored crew members stepped forward, their voice low and impatient. "We're wasting time. If we stay here any longer, we'll draw attention, and you know what's out there." Rail raised a hand, silencing the crew member, then turned back to Elias and Shariana. "Look, we don't have time for a long explanation. We can help you, but you need to trust us. We have limited time to get you to safety before things take a turn for the worse." Shariana's heart pounded in her chest. What did they mean by "what's out there"? She could sense the urgency in Rail's voice, the tension in their crew. Something was coming, and it wasn't just the hostile environment of Gathos, 5. Elias, still wary but understanding the gravity of the situation, finally nodded. "All right, we'll go with you. But if you try anything, dash." Rail cut him off with a sharp nod. "Understood. We're not your enemies. In fact, you'll see soon enough that we may be the only friends you have out here." The next few minutes were a blur as the crew of the Horizon's Grace worked quickly to secure the Redbird for transport. Their movements were efficient, their communication crisp and to the point. Shariana couldn't help but marvel at their professionalism. Whoever they were, they operated like a well-oiled machine, and that gave her a measure of reassurance. But still, something gnawed at the back of her mind. As they prepared to transfer to the Horizon's Grace, Elias leaned close to Shariana and whispered, "Keep your guard up. We don't know what we're walking into." Shariana nodded, her eyes scanning the crew as they moved about. There was an undercurrent of tension between them, like they were racing against a clock. Whatever was out here, it had them on edge, and that alone was enough to put her on high alert. Once they boarded the Horizon's Grace, Shariana immediately noticed the stark difference in the ship's condition compared to the Redbird. The interior was sleek and well-maintained, though it had the worn look of a vessel that had seen plenty of action. The ship's crew moved with purpose, guiding Shariana and Elias to a central area where Rael stood waiting for them. "We'll be leaving this system shortly," Rael said, their tone clipped. "You'll be safe on board, but we need to talk about your situation. Your distress signal went out across a wide frequency range. We're not the only ones who heard it." Elias frowned. Who else could have heard it? Rael's expression darkened behind the visor. Pirates, raiders, and worse. This region of space has become a hunting ground for scavengers and worse things. Things that used to haunt these systems long before civilized space reached its borders. Shariana's stomach twisted with unease. Worse things? Rael nodded grimly. "We've encountered them before, remnants of old war machines, forgotten by time. They don't respond to negotiation, and they don't leave survivors." A heavy silence filled the room. Shariana exchanged a glance with Elias, who looked equally grim. They had been right to be cautious. This part of space held dangers beyond their imagination. "And you're just patrolling out here, knowing that's what you're up against?" Elias asked incredulously. Rael shrugged. "Someone has to. There are old relics of civilizations long gone, technology that could shift the balance of power in the galaxy. We're salvagers, sure, but we're also here to make sure those relics don't fall into the wrong hands." Shariana's mind whirled with the implications. They had stumbled into something far bigger than they had realized. This wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about navigating a galaxy filled with ancient dangers and forgotten powers. And now, they were caught in the middle of it. Before they could ask more, the ship's alarms blared to life, and Rael's crew snapped into action. "Proximity alert," one of the crew members shouted. "Something's approaching fast." Rael turned sharply, motioning for Shariana and Elias to follow. "Stay close. We're about to find out exactly what heard your distress call." They rushed down the narrow corridors, the hum of the ship's engines growing louder as the Horizon's Grace began evasive maneuvers. Shariana's heart raced as they reached the command deck, where a large view screen displayed a massive, looming shape approaching from the darkness of space. It was unlike anything she had ever seen before. A hulking, metallic behemoth, its form twisted and jagged, as if it had been pieced together from the wreckage of 1,000 different ships. Its lights flickered erratically, and its movements were jerky, almost unnatural. The sight of it sent a shiver down her spine. "That's not a pirate ship," Elias muttered, his voice tense. "What the hell is that?" Rael's jaw tightened. "It's one of the old war machines I told you about. Automated, built for destruction. And it's heading straight for us." The crew scrambled to their stations, activating weapons and shields. Shariana felt the ship shudder as it powered up its defenses. This wasn't just a scavenger fight, this was something far more dangerous. Elias grabbed her arm, pulling her toward one of the safety harnesses. "Hold on tight," he said, his voice low but urgent. "This is going to get ugly." The war machine drew closer, its hulking form filling the view screen. Shariana's heart raced as she strapped herself in, her eyes locked on the approaching threat. The Horizon's Grace unleashed a volley of plasma fire, but the machine barely slowed, its thick armor absorbing the hits. "We can't outrun it," one of the crew members shouted. "It's gaining on us." Rael's face was grim as they barked orders, directing the crew to focus on disabling the machine's propulsion. But Shariana could see the doubt in their eyes. This was a battle they might not win. As the war machine loomed closer, Shariana felt a strange calm wash over her. They had escaped Gathos, 5, survived the dangers of that forsaken planet, only to face an even greater threat in the cold void of space. But something about this moment felt inevitable, as if they had been destined to encounter this ancient terror all along. And then, with a deafening roar, the battle began.